In the early 20th century, the predominant ideology in the Arab world was pan-Arab nationalism. However, the repressed Islamic orthodoxy was not to remain silent, as the Muslim Brotherhood, under its founder Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb, began to fundamentally change the scope of the Islamic and secular world, with Wahhabi Islam emanated from Saudi Arabia as the ideology which would replace the secular nationalism which gave many Arab countries Western influence. Afghanistan of the 1970s to the present moment would witness frenzied radical changes from its political foundations to numerous coups d'etats and religious sectarian conflicts that still mar the country to the present moment, all of which gave the world unforgettable historical events that changed the landscape of the globe forever. And we'll start with the Saur Revolution, which was a coup d'etat led by the Soviet-backed People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, led by Hafizullah Amin in 1978, which helped overthrow the Afghan government led by its first president, Mohammad Daoud Khan, who also led a revolt against Afghanistan's last king, Mohammad Zahir Shah, in 1973. Under Khan in 1973, his government implemented socialist ideals. However, he tried to distance himself from more rigid communist principles for which the Soviet Union saw this as a threat, as they were fearing Khan's Afghanistan, which could become closer to the United States politically, which could threaten Soviet's influence in the country and the region itself. Thus, the revolution in 1978 under Amin and Nur Muhammad Taraki. However, shortly after the coup, the relationship between Taraki and Amin soured, as Taraki accused Amin of nepotism, which is favoring family members for job positions, after Amin had appointed several family members to high-ranking positions. However, under the Taraki-Amin government, the socialist Afghans began, with support of the government and the Soviets, began a brutal push for communist ideals which caused aggression against the Pashtuns and the religious sector of the country. And this led to numerous bloodied acts of violence, as well as repressing even the moderately religious Afghans. And with these numerous acts of bloodied violence, this began a global call from the Afghan resistance with outside influence, most notably from Abdullah Azzam, who was in Egypt and Jordan at the time. However, in 1979, after an unsuccessful assassination plot against Amin, Taraki was arrested and executed without support from the Soviets, who favored Taraki. The Soviets then killed Hafizullah Amin on December 27th, 1979, as the Soviet military raided the Taj Beg Palace, which was located in the capital of Kabul. This led to the Soviet military invading the capital, and then we saw the global community led by the United States, and as well as the Islamic community, foreign fighters coming in to the country, with numerous people within the country making the call that there was a secular invader trying to repress the Afghan community as a whole. But this soon became much bigger, as they saw the Soviet invasion as a secular threat to Islam in itself. This would become the epicenter of all Muslims around the world being invited to enter the conflict. Numerous Afghan leaders like Yunus Khalis of the Hezb Islami Khalis group, Abu Rabib Rasul Sayyaf, who headed the Ittihad al-Islami, Nasrallah Mansour, Mohammed Nabi, Ahmed Gilani of the National Islamic Front of Afghanistan, Sigratullah Mujahid, Afghan National Liberation Front, Burhanuddin Rabbani of the Jamaat-e-Islami, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Hizb Islami Hekmatyar, and Jalaluddin Haqqani of the Hizb-e-Islami Khalis faction. So there are numerous factions inside Pakistan and Afghanistan that were trying to repress the forward military invasion of the Soviet Union. And so the Afghans began to push back. The Afghans were noted to be very valiant fighters. However, they were getting slaughtered on the battlefield as the Soviets had the technological advantage of using tanks, AK-47s, military arms that were much greater than the Afghans had. And so under the presidency of Jimmy Carter, led by his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, they began using the CIA to funnel arms and train fighters in the cities of Islamabad and Jalalabad in Pakistan, which acted as the conduit to running guns and money to Afghan warlords, such as the ones I mentioned previously. And soon we saw a few of these Afghan leaders begin calling for a global jihad, inviting foreign fighters, and they were called Arabs. The Afghans didn't like the invitation of the Arabs because they saw the Arabs as fundamentally lacking in regards to logistics and military training. However, what the Arabs had on their side was a fervent belief led by the ideologies of Salafi or Wahhabi Islam, and that they would prepare themselves to be killed on the battlefield. In fact, they rather entertained the idea. And so there was a lot more of Arab fighters than there were of Afghan fighters. And so with notable leaders such as Abdullah Azzam being invited by Abdul Rasul Sayyaf and Jalaluddin Haqqani, who tried to invite Arabs into their ranks, other Afghan leaders would not. However, these groups would become some of the largest groups in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And soon, Arab fighters and Arab money men began entering the conflict using their influence from notable countries such as Saudi Arabia, the Sudan, Egypt, Iran, and Pakistan. And so one notable Saudi began using his finances from his family's business, and that's Osama bin Laden, who was actually entertained by Abdullah Azzam, Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, to construct a business center inside Pakistan that would act as a recruitment office. And the name of this place would be the Maktab al-Khidmat, which means Afghan Services Bureau. With bin Laden's financing and the blessing of Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, who was the head of the Ittihad al-Islami party, as well as being the leader in Islamabad, he got the blessings from Azzam to allow bin Laden to finance the building. And it became numerous office buildings in time, as numerous, in the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these foreign fighters, which they began calling themselves the Mujahideen. Soon after, the CIA, the British MI6, the Israeli Mossad, the Pakistan ISI, all began financing and training these foreign fighters to help try to propel the Soviets from the country. In time, as the country began to witness a fundamental change from socialist ideals to a religious inversion itself, in 1989, while the Soviets finally retreated. The communist regime, the government itself, was trying to repress two factions from trying to take over the country, and these two factions were actually at odds with one another, and this led to the two civil wars that the country saw, which was actually far worse than the 10 years of the conflict which we saw the Soviets. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in the process, and this was led by the Taliban under Mullah Omar and Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was calling his side the Northern Alliance. The north of the country controlled by Massoud, the south of the country controlled by Mullah Omar. Now, powerful Pakistan leaders such as Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was on a tentative relationship with Azzam, tried to stay on the sidelines as much as possible until he saw an eventual winner, in which he saw the Taliban is winning most of the country over. And with this, these warlords like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Jalaluddin Haqqani began implementing the groups. In fact, Haqqani left the Islamic network and began his own group, which was called the Haqqani Network in time. And so we saw this fundamental change of socialist communist ideals, which was replaced in time by the religious sector. And Afghanistan gave us the world. It became the foundational point of numerous terrorist ideologies. In fact, Al-Qaeda, which was actually created in the Mossad camp, Al-Mossad, which was nicknamed the Lion's Den, created by bin Laden because he was dismayed at the more religious, spiritual ideals, which was not as militant that bin Laden saw, because he wanted to expel not just the Soviets, but any secular invader, including the West, from ever trying to usurp Islamic ideals in any Arab country. And so he wanted to create a group that was militant in its ideals. And so he created the Al-Mossad camp, which gave us Al-Qaeda later on, because the foundational leaders, or the members, the primary members, such as Abu al-Bashiri, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and many other people, Jamal al-Fadl, other Egyptians and Saudis, who would later have an influence in Al-Qaeda as they began their regroup in the Sudan. Because after the Afghanistan war, bin Laden was actually expelled from Saudi Arabia as he tried to influence the Saudi kingdom to use his group, the Mujahideen fighters, to expel the incoming Iraqi Ba'athist regime from invading Saudi Arabia, which they never were to begin with. This was false reporting from the West, the United States in general, and it was reported by the Soviets, because the rumor was that the Ba'athist regime, after invading Kuwait, was right at the border of Saudi Arabia, and that never really happened. But the Saudis bought it, the kingdom did, and they feared that this would happen. And instead, they denied bin Laden's request, which was pretty forward on his request. And so King Fahd expelled him from the country, fearing that the Mujahideen would visit violence upon their country. And so bin Laden actually met with Prince Turki, the leader of the General Intelligence Directorate in charge of intelligence, Prince Turki. He met with him on the down low, and Turkey actually said, we'll unfreeze your assets, give you back your passport, but you have to go to another country in order to do this, to make this agreement work. And so Hassan al-Turabi, leader of the National Islamic Front of the Sudan, invited bin Laden and his Mujahideen group to the Sudan, in which bin bin Laden bought a large amount of land. He bought a house in the Sudan, and basically created or regrouped the Mujahideen, and it became Al Qaeda later on. And we saw the first instances of terrorist bombings, most notably the bombings that took place later on, which would be 1998 East Africa bombings. But after that, the United States pressured the Sudan, and they expelled bin Laden. Bin Laden took this as an offense, but he understood the reason why, because the CIA actually was near bin Laden's house, and they tried to assassinate him a couple of times, but that didn't work. And so he left to Afghanistan and made a deal with Mullah Omar in 1999 not to conduct terrorist operations while he's there as a guest of the Taliban, who was in the process of trying to eliminate the Northern Alliance. And I think what happened here, and this is speculation on my part, but probably can make a good argument for it, bin Laden actually made a deal with Mullah Omar, the Taliban, that he would actually kill Ahmad Shah Massoud, and Taliban would rule the country. And that's what happened on September 9th, 2001. Ahmad Shah Massoud was assassinated by two men posing as French journalists, and they were Al-Qaeda leaders, Al-Qaeda members. And it was a martyrdom operation. They both were killed as a bomb was hiding inside the camera. It didn't kill Azzam right away, but it injured him gravely, and he was killed on his way to the hospital. However, going back to my point, in that Afghanistan was really, truly the epicenter of what we saw in this fundamental change from socialist ideals, which was precipitated by the Soviets' communist regime, which was a repressive regime in that it helped precipitate this religious uprising inside the country, which had favor from the religious sector outside of the country, helped by the intelligence apparatuses of the United States, led by the CIA, as well as other countries involved, because it was beneficial for them, because they not only repressed the communist invasion of Afghanistan, which would have gave them a superpower in its own right, which also saw the elimination of the prospects of gaining the oil refineries into countries such as maybe Iraq or maybe Iran. But with the repression of the Soviets into the communists and by the religious sector, helped in part by the intelligence agencies, this also in return saw and witnessed numerous terrorist groups emanating from these civil wars in Afghanistan into the world itself. Because after the Mujahideen left the country, they left back to their respective countries, this ideology that precipitated in the minds of these Mujahideen fighters saw and witnessed numerous conflicts around the world, such as Indonesia, the Philippines, which gave us the Balkan Wars, the Croatian Wars, the Yugoslav conflict, which was basically the nationalist communist ideals against these religious sectors that were heavily influenced by these Afghan and most notably the Arab groups and leaders, which were far more fervent than the Afghans themselves. The Afghans were nationalists, the Arabs were not. They were led by, of course, by the Wahhabi ideals supported by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, who pumped in hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars because they feared that because they invited the United States military into its own country to protect them, it was basically a form of blackmail to these groups so that they wouldn't attack the kingdom. So these groups like Al-Qaeda, the Haqqani Network, Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, Boko Haram in Africa, East Africa, these groups got hundreds of millions of dollars to conduct operations in their countries, and then we saw widespread conflicts in Southeast Asia and in the Middle East. And evidently, it came back to haunt the United States, which the intelligence apparatuses basically were either privy to this in the years prior and allowed these groups to come inside the United States, or that they were unsurprisingly, remarkably ignorant regarding what they helped create in Afghanistan by giving these Mujahideen fighters millions of dollars, which not only saw offices in Pakistan and Afghanistan, but inside the United States as well. The Afghan Services Bureau not only resided in Pakistan, but they had an actual office building in Brooklyn, New York, which was the Al-Khifa Refugee Center, which saw millions of dollars, not from just the CIA, but also from Saudi donors, and well as donors inside the United States. And then we saw a notable terrorist led by Omar Abdel Rahman of the Gamma Islamiyah, who was a renowned terrorist in Egypt on a terrorist watch list, who was allowed to come inside the United States, all at the behest of the CIA, because his visa application, which was approved in Cairo, Egypt, under the embassy in Cairo, which was a CIA base operation and approved by a CIA operative dressing as an embassy delegate, which approved his application. He comes to the United States. His influence is very widespread with the Islamic community. Numerous Islamic charities began popping up even before his invitation to the United States. The World Islamic Front, the Arab World Youth, the Muslim World League, which is the biggest Islamic community inside the United States. And so we saw numerous Saudi donors, pumping in tens of millions of dollars into these communities. And then we saw the rise of the fundamentalist sector inside the United States. And with the death of Pan-Arabism in the 1970s, we saw the change into the fundamental religious sector, this Wahhabi ideology, which is seen not just in the 1980s, but to the current period, to the present moment. And so is it too late to repress these groups? And why is the United States, of all countries, allied with Saudi Arabia? Well, you would have to go back many years, decades prior, to see how the relationship started, and which is basically upon the implementation and the regulation of its oil reserves, and as well as creating a lobby inside the United States, which the Saudis are influencing our congressional leaders with tens of millions of dollars annually inside the United States. And so they're influencing even the Democratic and Republican party delegates to favor and basically ignore the terrorism that's happening worldwide, with two notable countries, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, acting as the conduits for Islamic terrorism. And so to end the video, the problems began not just with the 1979 Afghan conflict in Afghanistan, but with the elimination of Pan-Arabism as a whole, which was influenced by the West of the United States and Great Britain, because they saw these Arab nationalist states as a threat to their influence in the oil market, as the oil reserves, and in the region itself politically as well. And so not everything is so black and white in regards to Islam or Arabs or socialism and progressivism, and why these ideals in these countries and these intelligence agencies helped shape events such as the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the Khobar Towers bombing, the East Africa embassy bombings, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and of course, the 2001 terrorist attacks inside the United States. And so this is where I would suggest that people start looking into, and it's definitely worth understanding into how these Wahhabi ideologies began and what led to its prominence around the world.